about it. A few days later, my brother comes home from school, and he talks about his friend seeing this circular impression up on the hill. The following spring, Merle Partridge had a UFO sighting over his house. He said he was would have been the spring in 1967. He was lying out on his deck, and this huge UFO went over the house. It was a dark charcoal gray. It made no sound whatsoever. It just soundlessly passed over his house. But he said it was so large it darkened out the entire, it darkened out, where he was lying, and it just disappeared after that. He had other things happen too, which I'm happy to tell you. There's one.
I tell you that happened at my house, and if a UFO kind of went over my house like that, I tell you, I don't know how scared I would be. And, I'd even as big as I am, I'd find a way to get underneath my bed. But, yeah, please do.
Also, here's a couple of other stories Merle Partridge told me along with that one, because I asked him, this is back in 2008 when I interviewed him. He knew who I was, of course, because I grew up with his kids. So he said also the following spring, about 10 o'clock at night again, he heard a knock at the door. He opened up the door, and he saw a man about 40 years old, and this man said to him, "I just ran my Jeep into a ditch, but that's not what I'm worried about. I cannot find my 6-year-old son." He said he was driving, the road in front of the Partridge farmhouse, and again, something sort of blacked out. Something sort of rolled across the car, or a wing or something blacked out the windshield. He couldn't see in front of him. He ran his Jeep into a ditch. When he looked over at the seat, they didn't have children's seats back then. He looked over at the seat. His son was missing. He was completely gone. The man runs over to Merle Partridge's house. They go out looking for the little boy. They don't find him. They go back into the house, and they call the Salem police department. It takes them probably 20 minutes or a half hour to get there. So here comes the police, and they all go out on a search for this little boy. And Mr. Partridge said, up the road in the opposite direction, here comes the little boy, walking, just almost like he's in a daze, or he is sleepwalking, in the opposite direction of where the Jeep was heading. So when they go get the little boy, he does not remember that hour or so that he was missing. He had no recollection of anything that had happened to him. So, it turned out great, because, the man got his son back and forgot about it. Mr. Partridge said many years later, a middle-aged man knocked on his door again, and again he was about 40 years old, and the man said to him, "You don't remember me, but I'm the little boy that was lost that night." He said, "And even to this day, I cannot remember that hour that I was missing." So that happened to Mr. Partridge as well.
Interesting.
He was also working as a truck driver, and he was coming back home, and it was very early in the morning. He got extremely tired and sleepy, so he decided to pull his truck alongside the road about 100 miles from his house, and he went to sleep. And when he woke up, he said that his body was completely covered in cobwebs. So those stories are not completely. I did mention them a little bit in Nick Redfern's book, The Black Diaries. A lot of these are written down in his book. If your listeners are interested, The Black Diaries by Nick Redfern. But these are all entirely new stories. They were just, and why are they new? Well, John Keel just never went back and interviewed the witnesses any further. As soon as he had enough material for a book, I suppose he closed it down and he decided to write his book. But, it continued on, as I said, up until about 1970.
Well,
and that's when it seemed to come.
I
don't know why.
It'd be so eerie to wake up and covered in cobwebs. That is really scary. And it sounds like the young boy was abducted by that UFO. So, he doesn't remember anything. I'm just wondering if he was implanted or something. But, that's interesting.
Yes, and my family had all kinds of strange experiences. You know, I think they target certain families. And the interesting thing about this is most of these Mothman witnesses, including Woodrow Dernberger, who had the encounter with Indrid Cold. I hope your listeners know that story. If not, just look it up. But we all have Native American ancestry. The Partridges were part black Saponi. Mr. Dernberger was part Shawnee, or he called himself Black Dutch. My grandmother was Black Dutch, and I'm Delaware and Shawnee. So many of these witnesses, for some really strange reason, had Native American ancestry. But when you think about it, you know, the Tibetans have they have a name for the men in black. And when I had a DNA test, my DNA traced right back to Tibet. So that's where it traced to.
Interesting.
So there's something strange going on.
Oh, yeah. Now, when these men in black were going around and doing their thing, did they actually, when they interviewed people, did they make any threats to anybody or anything?
Subtle threats. And, of course, they seemed extremely stupid. They would arrive in these late model cars, or these cars that, you know, maybe from the 1950s at the time that looked brand new, and they would sort of subtly threaten some of the witnesses. Now, the two that Jeannie and I saw up on the hill, they did not look like the Blues Brothers, which is what, when they're portraying the men in black, that's usually what they're portraying. They just simply had on black pants and a black shirt. One of them looked Caucasian, just looked ordinary Caucasian. The other one looked Asian, looked like an Asian man with his hair bleached blonde, which a person dressed in black, an Asian person dressed in black with his hair bleached blonde would not seem unusual now. It was then.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
And also Woodrow Dernberger, who had the Indrid Cold, he was stopped, you know, by Indrid Cold's UFO on I-77, Route 47. That was actually on November 2nd, 1966. It predated the Mothman by about 12 days. But Indrid Cold seemed to be your typical man in black. He was dressed all in black. And that in itself is another fascinating story. But so that happened in Parkersburg. And Mr. Dernberger was interviewed about being stopped by Indrid Cold on live TV the next day, which was all recorded. And because of my ghost tour, because my ex-husband worked for the local NBC affiliate, the man that interviewed Woodrow Dernberger, who had the encounter with Indrid Cold, he was cleaning out his desk, and he thought maybe I'd like to have those old reel-to-reel tapes. He was about to throw them away.
Oh,
they were 35 years old at that time. They're now, 52 years old, and they're now in the Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant. They're really the only, other than the witnesses, you know, where they wrote out, you know, their accounts of seeing the Mothman. That's some of the few actual objects they have from that time period. So, yeah, written right on those old reel. And I had those transferred, too. So, yeah, they're available.
Interesting. Now,
so it's very interesting.
James out there is asking a question. I guess there was the Indian chief around there that cursed some land around Point Pleasant.
Yeah, I think this is like 1777. It was a Shawnee Chief Cornstalk, and there was lots of wars, a lot of Indian wars. You know, the Shawnee were quite fierce fighters, and they put Chief Cornstalk, they were going to put him in jail because they didn't trust him, and this was in the Point Pleasant jail. And somehow one of these younger men, they don't know who exactly it was, accidentally shot and murdered Chief Cornstalk. And as he was dying, he put a curse on the Ohio Valley. Now, whether this had anything to do with the Mothman, I really can't say. My friend, it's interesting, my friend that runs the local ghost hunters group, Tom Moore, is a descendant of Cornstalk. So I do know that I did notice every time I go to Point Pleasant, I seem to get a headache. I don't know why, but I don't know. You know, I can't honestly say. To me, it doesn't really make a whole lot of logical sense. But you know, anything's possible. Yeah, Chief Cornstalk's curse. we've had other tragedies. There's been plants that have, a scaffolding that killed about 50 people in the 1970s here. So, yeah, there's a lot of it that's attributed to cheap cornstalk, but I don't have an answer to that. But I do know that that's a theory.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you can take it each way. I mean, if a curse is put on the land, it seems interesting with the Mothman, and then you have all, the UFO. Has there been any UFO sightings in the area in the last couple of years?
Well, let me just tell you one more thing about cheap cornstalk that I suddenly remembered. I did a documentary called Eyes of the Mothman in Point Pleasant. It's a wonderful documentary. People really should, it might even be free now, but they should look that up. They wanted me to walk up to Chief Cornstalk's grave, and for some reason, I placed my hand on his stone monument. They've reburied him several times. He's buried in the park in Point Pleasant. And so then I walked back, and the director said to me, "Did you have any strange feelings when you put your hand on his monument?" I said, "No, not really." He said, "Well, when you put your hand on Cornstalk's monument, all of our equipment shut down. And it was only when you walked away from the monument that the equipment came back on." UFO sightings, the most of them, yeah, I know at least there was one that was reported back in 1987 around Mineral Wells, pretty much where Woodrow Dernberger encountered Indrid Cold. You never know with these sightings, though. There's different types. There's the hardware kind of sighting where they actually see this the actual spacecraft, and then you have the sightings of the lights in the sky. So I'm not sure what kind that was, but it was very intense. There were tons of UFO sightings, 66 going into 67 in West Virginia and southern Ohio. My grandfather had one, and several people in my family experienced them as well. And so, yep.
So about the same time the Mothman was circulating then.
Yes, we can't I think the director of the movie wanted me to make some sense out of that, and I've never been able to, of why hardware combined with these flesh creatures, because the Men in Black, from what I could sense from them, and also what Woodrow Dernberger said about Indrid Cold, there was something about them that did not seem entirely human. When Indrid Cold stopped Woodrow Dernberger's truck and got out of his UFO, it was hovering above the highway. As he begins to walk toward Woodrow Dernberger's truck, this is on November 2nd, 12 days before the Mothman, he heard Indrid Cold say to him, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. I only want to ask you a few questions." And that's when Mr. Dernberger became afraid, because he realized as this man was speaking to him, his lips did not move. And that is when, Indrid Cold says to Mr. Dernberger, "Roll down your window. I just want to ask you some questions." And Indrid Cold says to Dernberger, "You can think or you can speak. I can understand you either way." And according to Dernberger, most of the conversation was through telepathy. He points toward the lights of Parkersburg. This is a man about 35 years of age, all dressed in dark clothing, hair slicked straight back, dark hair, had a tan complexion. He said underneath that black coat he could see a material that seemed like a glistening kind of material. Indrid Cold pointed toward the lights of Parkersburg and said, "What do you call that?" Woodrow Dernberger said, "Well, that's Parkersburg. I call that a city." And Indrid Cold said, "Where I come from, we call it a gathering." And then Indrid Cold says to Dernberger, he said, do people work there? Do they live there?" And Mr. Dernberger said yes. And then Cold says, "Do you work?" And Mr. Dernberger said, "Yes, I'm a salesman." He was a salesman at the J.C. Penney store. Indrid Cold answered to him, "I'm a searcher." He said, "I'm a searcher." And he asked him some mundane questions for maybe 5 minutes.